What up, YouTube? LTH back with another video. 713 the Space City. We in the building again. So I haven't spoke on this. Wish I could have spoke on this sooner, but it was official that it was not. Hell, even I understood that it wouldn't be a surprise if Nick Caley was back for at least another year as Texans offensive coordinator for the Texans. You know, even though there was some OCs that I actually wanted in Houston, for example, such as, Joe Brady, Brian Dable, who's with the Tennessee Titans, and Mike McDaniel, who's with the Chargers, Cliff Kingsbury, who's on the verge of possibly being hired as the Giants' next offensive coordinator. Since the Redskins were dumb enough to let him walk, knowing that it wasn't his fault that his offense was enduring injuries and stuff. There was some other, under the radar names, that Bears OC who went to the Ravens, but I'm gonna go ahead and talk about it, on my thoughts about Nick Caley returning as OC of the Texans. Well, hell, they could have went and got a offensive coordinator from college. But it is what it is. So I'm gonna put in my 2 cents of Nick Caley returning as Texans OC. Well, and yeah, it sucks. He was a first time play caller, which not every Texans fan, such as myself, was happy about. But it's nothing like I like to call rolling the dice once again. So Nick Caley coming back, got my mixed thoughts. I ain't gonna lie. Considering the fact that he started off slow, you know, predictable play calling, the early part in the season, and I get it. It's the offense's job to execute, and it is, of course, C.J. Stroud's job to change, call the audible if it means changing the play around, especially if Stroud doesn't like how the offense play calls was set up. But Nick Caley, had moments that he didn't in posi- put the offense in position to execute. Courtesy of his predictable play calling, knowing that knowing that the opposing defenses knew what they were trying to throw their way. So he sucked in there early going. Could have done a lot better. You know, yeah, the scoring offense was, of course, the middle of the pack, thanks to some improvements late in the year. It did. Nick Caley did show signs of improvement as the latter part of the season. You know, like I mentioned, though, I just wish he would have, did a better job in the early going. You know, put the offense in top 10 fashion. But he did improve. There were plays that he called some good plays, but it was just unfortunate that Stroud happened to have missed throws, under and overthrew, you know, pretty much inaccurate as heck. Too low, too high of throws. But, you know, Nick Caley did call some good plays, but, you know, it was the adjustments that I was concerned with, not just in the first half, but in the second half as well. You know, and then I find myself thinking, if Nick Caley finds ways to deliver some good adjustments, the offense will thrive consistently, no matter what. But, consistently, that wasn't always the case. You know, yeah, they put up, 40 plus points twice this year, along with putting up 30 plus points, like 3 times this year. The team was, but not to mention, you know, Nick Caley, you know, I feel like, he was a C minus as first year OC. That's my grade I give Nick Caley. Yeah, he did show it, or better yet, I'm gonna give him a C plus. Let me throw him a C plus at best. Because of the late year improvements. I'm tripping. Yeah. So with Nick Caley, I mean, he understands how to use the hell out of tight ends. I will give him that, knowing that he was a tight ends coach along with a pass game coordinator for the Rams. Dalton tight end production from Dalton Schultz, who's a pending free agent in 2025, in which I'll do a video on who the Texans should keep or who they should let walk a little later on. But Nick Caley, yeah, he had an okay first year as OC. Could have been higher had he had a better game planning along with better adjustments. From week 2, for example, versus Tampa Bay. So with Nick Caley coming back, the the adjustments from Nick Caley got to be a lot better. Offensive game planning and adjustments got to be a lot better than 2025. And the offense got to at least be top 10. Top 10 scoring offense, total offense, got to be at least top 10 in 2026. Because if the offense, sucks again in 2026, on some bottom feeder-ish type stuff, Nick Caley's probably a gunner, meaning time for another OC once more. So let's see what happens. See how he does. Hopefully he makes much better adjustments in 2026. Can only hope for the best, right? All right, peace.